May 1945. Europe lay in ruins. The Third Reich, which had promised to last 1,000 years, had collapsed in just 12. The ashes of Berlin had not yet cooled when American officers began gathering key figures of the Nazi regime for interrogation. Among the prisoners was a man who knew all the secrets of the German war machine, Albert Speer. Speer was not a typical Nazi functionary. An architect by training, he had become Minister of Armaments at the most critical moment of the war. Hitler trusted him completely. Speer controlled the entire military industry of the Reich, every factory, every mine, every worker. He was a man of numbers and logic in a regime built on ideology and violence. The Americans understood the value of such a prisoner. They created a special group, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Its task was to determine how effective the massive raids on Germany had been. Millions of tons of bombs had been dropped on German cities. Thousands of aircraft had not returned. Tens of thousands of airmen had died. Now they needed to understand whether it had all been in vain. Paul Nitze was chosen to interrogate Speer. He was 38 years old, an economist, a Harvard graduate, a man of sharp intellect and methodical approach. Nitze was not a military interrogator in the traditional sense. He was an analyst, capable of seeing the big picture behind small details. The first meeting took place in mid-May. Speer sat across from Nitze in a small room somewhere in occupied Germany. The former minister looked worn out, but maintained outward composure. He knew his fate depended on how useful he would prove to the victors. Nitze began methodically. He did not ask obvious questions about war crimes or politics. He was interested in numbers, production charts, supply chains. When exactly had German industry reached its peak? Which regions were most important? Which factories produced critically important products? Speer answered in detail, almost pedantically. He had a phenomenal memory for production details. He remembered monthly tank output figures, the amount of coal mined, kilometers of railroad track. These numbers were his weapon for survival. The first day of interrogation lasted several hours. Nitze took notes, asked clarifying questions, cross-checked answers with data the Americans already had. The picture was beginning to clear, but it turned out to be unexpected. On the second day, Nitze moved to more specific questions about the bombing campaign. The American and British Air Forces had spent enormous resources destroying German industry. Strategists believed in certain priority targets. The ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt were considered critically important. Without bearings, tanks, aircraft, and all machinery could not function. Speer listened and shook his head. The raids on Schweinfurt were impressive, he said. The Americans had lost many bombers. The factories had indeed suffered, but this did not stop German production. Bearings began to be imported from neutral Sweden. Production was distributed among smaller enterprises. Reserves turned out to be larger than the Allies had assumed. Nitze took notes. So one of the main targets had not produced the expected effect. Billions of dollars, thousands of lives, for limited results. But Speer continued. There were targets that had truly inflicted damage. The third day was devoted to the transportation system. Speer explained that the German war machine was completely dependent on railroads. There were not enough trucks. Fuel was scarce. Almost everything moved by rail: troops, weapons, coal, food. When the Allies began systematically bombing railroad junctions and bridges, the effect was devastating. Factories could operate, but finished products got stuck on the tracks. Tanks sat near factories, unable to reach the front. Coal did not reach power plants. Food rotted in warehouses. Speer described the chaos of the final months of the war. Germany was turning into isolated industrial islands, unable to coordinate efforts. The central planning he had been so proud of was falling apart, not because of lack of production capacity, but because of the impossibility of delivering anything, anywhere. Nitze asked technical questions about track repair, alternate routes, the capabilities of repair crews. Speer's answers were honest. The Germans did indeed repair damaged tracks quickly, but the Allies bombed faster than restoration was possible. The fourth day brought an even more important revelation. Nitze asked about oil. Speer paused, then began to speak. His voice was quieter, almost pensive. Oil was Germany's Achilles heel. It always had been. The Reich had no major deposits of its own. The Romanian fields at Ploiești were the only significant source of natural oil. Everything else was produced synthetically, from coal. This process required enormous factories, complex equipment, skilled workers. When the Allies began systematically bombing oil refineries in the spring of 1944, the results were catastrophic. Aviation fuel production dropped several times over. Tank divisions began experiencing fuel shortages. The Luftwaffe increasingly remained grounded, not because of aircraft shortages, but due to lack of fuel for them. Speer spoke of the May offensive of 1944, when American bombers descended on the synthetic plants. Each strike on Leuna or Politz meant weeks of downtime. These plants could not be quickly restored. The equipment was too complex, the processes too delicate. By the fall of 1944, Germany was producing only a small fraction of the necessary fuel. Armored divisions stood immobile. Fighters could not provide air cover over cities against bombers. The new Me-262 jet aircraft, which could have changed the course of the air war, sat idle on airfields. On the fifth day, Nitze devoted his questions to German arms production. Here, a paradoxical picture emerged. Despite the bombing, production of tanks and aircraft grew almost until the end of 1944. Speer was proud of this achievement. He had managed to organize industry so efficiently that destruction was compensated for by increased productivity. Factories went underground. Production lines were dispersed. Slave labor from millions of forced workers was used. Speer did not delve into the moral aspects of this system. He spoke of numbers, of efficiency, of results. But these tanks and aircraft could not fight without fuel. They could not reach the front without functioning railroads. Production statistics looked impressive on paper, but Germany's actual combat power was melting away. Nitze was beginning to understand the key truth. A modern army is not just weapons. It is a complex system of supply, logistics, and energy. You can produce thousands of tanks, but if they have no fuel and spare parts, they become scrap metal. The sixth day was devoted to the Allies' economic superiority. Speer spoke about this with almost academic interest. He had always known that Germany could not win a war of attrition. The industrial capacity of the United States was too enormous. One American plant, Willow Run, produced B-24 bombers faster than all German factories combined could turn out fighters. Every month, America built more ships than German submarines could sink in half a year. The Soviet Union stamped out T-34 tanks in such quantities that losses simply did not matter. Speer explained that he had tried to convey this reality to the Nazi leadership as early as 1943. The numbers were merciless. Germany could mobilize about 80 million people. Against it stood countries with a combined population of over 500 million. The United States alone produced more steel, aluminum, and copper than all of Europe. The war was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost in statistical tables and production charts even before it began. The bombing simply accelerated the inevitable. On the seventh day, Nitze summarized. He asked Speer to give an overall assessment of the Allied air campaign. The former minister reflected aloud. The bombing of cities, he said, was horrifying but not decisive. It killed civilians, destroyed residential areas, undermined morale, but military production recovered. The real blow came from precision attacks on critical infrastructure. Oil refineries, transportation hubs, the dams on the Ruhr that provided electricity to the industrial region. These targets were harder to bomb. They required precision and repeated raids, but these were what paralyzed the German war machine. Speer also noted the psychological effect of American daylight bombing raids. Germans had grown accustomed to British night raids, but when hundreds of B-17s flew in formation in broad daylight, ignoring anti-aircraft fire and fighters, it undermined faith in Germany's ability to defend its own skies. Nitze asked, when did Speer realize the war was lost? The answer was unexpected. In May 1944, after the first massive raids on oil plants. At that moment, it became clear that the Army would lose mobility and the Air Force would lose combat capability. Everything that happened afterward was just prolonging the agony. After 7 days of interrogation, Nitze had an enormous amount of information. He cross-referenced Speer's testimony with intelligence data, with pilot reports, with intercepted German documents. The picture that emerged was consistent and convincing. Strategic bombing worked, but not as originally intended. The idea of destroying a single critical type of production proved illusory. The German economy was too adaptive, too dispersed, but it depended on several key resources: fuel and transport. The Allies had stumbled upon the right strategy. Systematic destruction of the oil industry and transportation network proved decisive. It did not bring quick victory, but it made Germany's defeat inevitable long before the surrender. Nitze also understood the scale of American industrial superiority. The United States did not simply outproduce Germany. It created a wartime economy of unprecedented size. Factories worked around the clock. Women replaced men in production. Technological innovations were implemented in months, not years. The materials from Speer's interrogations formed the basis of the final report of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. This document, of hundreds of volumes, became a fundamental study of air warfare. It influenced military doctrine for decades to come. The conclusions were mixed. On one hand, the bombing played a critical role in victory. Without it, Germany could have held out longer, produced more weapons, killed more Allied soldiers. On the other hand, enormous resources were spent on ineffective targets. Tens of thousands of airmen died bombing factories that were rebuilt within weeks. Speer stood before the Nuremberg Tribunal. He was one of the few high-ranking Nazis who acknowledged the guilt of the regime. His cooperation with the Allies, including frank conversations with Nitze, may have saved his life. Instead of a death sentence, he received 20 years in prison. Nitze continued his career as a government official. He became one of the architects of American Cold War strategy. The experience gained analyzing the German economy, he applied when assessing Soviet industrial capacity. 7 Days with Speer taught him the importance of economic intelligence and systems thinking. The lessons from these interrogations remain relevant today. Modern warfare remains a war of economies and logistics. High-tech weapons are useless without fuel, spare parts, and trained personnel. Industrial capacity matters more than the size of an army. American industrial superiority in World War II was the result not only of the country's size, it was a deliberate mobilization of all resources, efficient organization of production, technological innovation. America became the arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt said. Germany, despite the technological mastery and organizational talent of people like Speer, was doomed from the moment it declared war on industrial giants. Talent and efficiency can compensate for lack of resources temporarily, but not forever. The interrogation room where Nitze and Speer met no longer exists. The building was probably demolished decades ago. But the records of those 7 days have been preserved. They are kept in archives, accessible to researchers and historians. In these yellowed pages is captured a unique moment in history. Victor and vanquished sit across from each other, discussing not ideology, not guilt, but the cold facts of production and destruction. Tank numbers and tons of bombs, kilometers of track and barrels of oil. Behind these numbers stood millions of fates. Workers in American factories who would never see the result of their labor. German civilians killed under bombs. Allied airmen shot down over foreign land. Forced laborers in German factories who died from exhaustion and cruelty. Speer knew about these people. He was responsible for the system that exploited their labor to death. But in conversations with Nitze, he spoke of them as statistical units, as resources. Such was the logic of total war, which turns people into numbers in production reports. When the interrogations ended, Nitze and Speer never met again. Their paths diverged forever. One returned to building a new world order. The other went to a prison cell to contemplate the destroyed old one. But the information they exchanged outlived them both. It changed the understanding of air warfare, influenced strategic planning, helped prepare for future conflicts. 7 days of conversations proved more important than many weeks of fighting. The history of war often focuses on battles and generals. But victories were forged in factory workshops, in design bureaus, in the offices of economic planners. World War II was a war of factories as much as a war of armies. And in this war of factories, America won decisively. German efficiency and discipline could not withstand enormous resources and productive capacity. Every shot-down American bomber was replaced by 3 new ones. Every sunken ship by 5. Germany could only count dwindling reserves and dying factories. Today, we study this history not to glorify war, but to understand its mechanisms. 7 days of interrogating Albert Speer became a window into the reality of total conflict. They showed that victory is determined not only by the bravery of soldiers, but by the efficiency of economic systems. They also reminded us of the cost of war. Behind every number in Speer's reports stood human lives. Behind every successful raid, destroyed cities and families. The effectiveness of strategic bombing was measured not only in destroyed factories, but in dead people. Perhaps the main lesson of these interrogations is that war is a system, complex, cruel, consuming resources and lives. Understanding this system does not make war justified, but it helps avoid it in the future. Or at least, that is the hope. The interrogation room is empty. The questions have been asked, the answers recorded. History continues.